Think about the last thing you deleted. A photo, a message, a file you did not want anymore. You dragged it somewhere, and it went, and you stopped thinking about it. Since the 1980s, that file has not gone anywhere. It sat exactly where it had always been, complete, readable, waiting for something else to need the space. There is an entire profession built on that gap, on the difference between a thing being gone and a thing being marked as no longer wanted. And in the last decade, quietly, that gap has been closing, not because of anything you did, because of firmware deciding on its own minutes after you hit delete. In the next half hour, I want to show you what the job actually looks like, what survives deletion, what does not, and why the answer changed. Including the case where a man was found because of who had last saved the church meeting agenda, and the case where a number that turned out to be wrong by a factor of 84 reached a jury anyway. The idea underneath all of this is 100 years old, and it was not about computers at all. Edmond Locard was a French forensic scientist, and the principle that carries his name says that every contact leaves a trace. Touch something and you take a little of it with you and leave a little of yourself behind. Dust, fibers, skin. The physical world does not do clean interactions. Digital forensics is that principle applied to storage, and the reason it works is that computers are far worse at clean interactions than the physical world is. A computer does not do anything once. It does it, and it logs it, and it caches it, and it writes an index entry, and it updates a timestamp, and it leaves a temporary file it forgets to remove. So the professional question is, never really was this done. It is which of the 11 places that record it still has a copy. Which brings us to what deleting a file actually is, because almost everybody has this wrong, and the wrongness is the entire foundation of the job. On a traditional hard disk, a file is two separate things. There is the content, the actual bytes, sitting in a sequence of blocks somewhere on the platter. And there is the bookkeeping, the file system's record of what that file is called, where its blocks are, when it was made, and that the space is in use. When you delete it, the system updates the bookkeeping. The entry is marked as no longer valid. The blocks are marked as available. It does not touch the content, not one byte of it. The file is still there, complete, intact. It has simply lost its name and its claim on the space it occupies. It stays there until something else needs those blocks and writes over them, which might be in a second, or a week, or never. That is why undelete tools work. That is why formatting a disk is not the same as erasing it. And that is why an entire industry exists. Now take it one step further, because this is where it gets genuinely strange. Suppose the blocks do get reused, but by a smaller file. The new file only fills part of the block. What is in the rest of it? The old data. Still sitting there, in the leftover space at the end of a block that something else now owns. That is called slack space, and it is a standard place to look. So even overwriting is often partial. You get fragments, a paragraph, a header, enough to know what was there, if not enough to reconstruct all of it. And fragments are frequently sufficient because the question in front of an investigator is usually not what did this document say in full. It is whether a document of this kind existed on this machine at all. And when the bookkeeping is gone entirely, when there is no record at all of a file having existed, there is still a technique. And it is my favorite thing in this discipline. It is called file carving, and it ignores the file system completely. It treats the whole drive as one long, undifferentiated ribbon of bytes. Because file formats give themselves away. A JPEG starts with a specific pair of bytes. So does a PDF. So does a zip archive. They are called magic numbers, and they are effectively signatures. So you scan the entire raw disk looking for those signatures, and every time you find one, you have found the beginning of a file that the computer no longer admits exists. No file name, no folder, no date, just a photograph reassembled out of a region of a disk that the operating system believes is empty. That is the classical picture of this job, and it held, more or less unchanged, for about 30 years. In February 2005, a floppy disk arrived at a television station in Wichita, Kansas. A purple Memorex, 1.44 megabytes, the standard capacity, and by 2005 already an obsolete format that most people had stopped using. It had been sent to KSAS TV by a man who had been communicating with police and press for a very long time, and who had never been identified. I am going to stay narrowly on the forensic step here. The crimes are not what this episode is about, and I'm not going to describe them. What matters for our purposes is that a man who had successfully avoided identification for decades chose to switch from paper to a disk. And that is the point where a category error becomes fatal, because a disk is not a piece of paper. A piece of paper contains what you put on it. A disk contains what you put on it, plus everything the computer decided to record while you were putting it there. Investigators examined the disk using EnCase, one of the standard forensic packages of the period, and they found a deleted Microsoft Word document. Deleted? Which, as we've just established, on that kind of media means present. The document itself was almost aggressively mundane. It was an agenda for a church council meeting, and the metadata attached to it recorded two things: that it had last been saved by a user called Dennis, and that the registered organization was Christ Lutheran Church. Not the content, the properties. A public search showed that the president of the council at Christ Lutheran Church in Park City was a man named Dennis Rader. A DNA sample obtained through his daughter's medical records matched crime scene evidence. He pleaded guilty later that year and is serving consecutive life sentences. From the arrival of that disk to the arrest was roughly 10 days. Decades of successful evasion ended by a field in a files properties dialog that the sender almost certainly did not know existed. And I want to draw out the general lesson, because it is the one that has kept being true for 20 years. The evidence was not in the message. The message had been written carefully. The evidence was in the record the software kept about the message. You can control what you write. Controlling what your tools write about what you write is a different and much harder discipline. Every document you produce carries fields you never fill in: author, organization, revision count, editing time, sometimes previous versions of the text. None of that is hidden, exactly. It is just in a panel nobody opens. So when people ask what a digital forensics investigator actually looks for, the honest answer is usually not the file. It is the exhaust. Now, none of what I have described is useful unless it survives a courtroom, and that constraint shapes the entire profession. Because here is the problem that sits at the front of every examination. Reading a disk, done carelessly, changes the disk. Plug a drive into a running computer, and the operating system will helpfully mount it, index it, update access times, maybe write a recovery file, possibly create a thumbnail cache. The evidence has now been altered by you before you looked at anything. The answer is a write blocker, a device, or in some setups, a piece of software that sits between the drive and the machine and physically refuses to pass a write command through. Read requests go through, write requests do not. The drive can be examined and cannot be changed, and that property is what makes the result worth anything. Then you do not work on the original at all. You make a bit-for-bit image, a complete copy of every sector, including the ones the file system says are empty, because those are where the interesting things are. And then you prove the copy is faithful, which is where cryptographic hashing comes in. A hash function takes any amount of data and produces a short, fixed-length fingerprint. Change one bit anywhere and the fingerprint changes completely. So you hash the original, hash the copy, and if the two match, you have demonstrated that the copy is identical, not similar, identical. MD5 was the standard for years. USH 256 is what current practice uses, and the reason is worth a sentence. MD5 is now considered broken for security purposes. It is possible to construct two different inputs with the same fingerprint. For evidence integrity, that is a weakness you do not want to have to explain. Every time the evidence moves, from the scene to the lab, from one examiner to another, into storage, the hash is recorded again alongside who had it and when. That documentation is the chain of custody, and it is not paperwork for its own sake. It is the mechanism by which anyone can check that nothing changed while nobody was watching. So the day-to-day of this profession is not dramatic recovery. It is blocking writes, imaging drives, computing hashes, and writing down what you did in order, with times. Which sounds tedious until you consider the alternative, which is a defense lawyer asking how you know the file was there before you arrived. There is one more layer, and it is the one most people outside the field have never heard of, and it is the reason this profession is a profession rather than a hobby. The tools themselves have to be tested independently against published specifications. In the United States, that work sits with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, in a program called Computer Forensics Tool Testing. CFTT publishes formal test specifications for the categories of thing a forensic tool does. Write blocking, disk imaging, deleted file recovery, file carving. It defines what correct behavior is, and then tools are tested against that definition, and the reports are published. And professional guidance. SWGDE, the scientific working group in this area, recommends that an organization validate every tool against those methods before using it on real casework. Not because vendors are dishonest, because software has bugs, and a bug in a forensic tool does not look like a crash. It looks like an answer. Hold on to that sentence. We are going to need it later, and it is going to be the most expensive idea in this episode. Now the change. Everything I've described about deleted files still being there is a description of a spinning magnetic disk. Solid-state drives do not work that way, and one specific consequence of how they work has rewritten this job in about a decade. Flash memory has an awkward property. You can write to an empty block quickly, but you cannot overwrite a used one directly. It has to be erased first, and erasing is comparatively slow. So an SSD that waits until you need the space to erase it will get slower and slower as it fills, which users noticed and complained about. The fix was to erase blocks in advance, during idle time, so there's always a supply of clean ones ready, which requires the drive to know which blocks are actually dead. That is what trim is. It is a command the operating system sends to the drive's controller when you delete a file, remove a partition, or format a disk. It says, these blocks are no longer in use. You do not need to preserve them. And then garbage collection. Firmware running inside the drive, on its own schedule, with nobody's involvement, goes and clears them. Which means that on a modern SSD, deletion is frequently converted into genuinely unrecoverable, not marked as available. Erased, often within minutes, by the drive, on its own initiative. Think about what that does to the 30 years of practice I described earlier. The old certainty was that seizing a machine quickly enough meant the data was probably still there, because only the bookkeeping had changed. Now the drive may have destroyed it before anybody arrived, without being asked, as routine maintenance. And crucially, it will do it while the drive is simply powered on, not while somebody is using it. While it is sitting there, I should be careful not to overstate this because the literature is clear that behavior varies. It depends on the interface, the file system, the operating system, and how the drive is configured. There are documented exclusions where trim does not reach. Certain RAID configurations, certain connection types, certain older systems. Investigators know these and look for them, because an exclusion is the difference between a drive that has quietly destroyed its own history and one that has not. Establishing which of those you are holding is now one of the first questions of an examination, and it is answered by testing the specific device rather than by assuming anything from the label on it. So the accurate statement is not that SSDs are unrecoverable. It is that recoverability is no longer the default assumption and has to be established rather than assumed. The practical response has not really changed. Image the drive with dedicated hardware as early as possible, then analyze the image rather than the device. What has changed is the value of the word early, which used to mean within days and now means something much closer to immediately. And there is a second order effect that I find quietly interesting. Because content is less reliably available, the relative importance of everything else has gone up. Logs, timestamps, indexes, metadata. The exhaust. The parts of the BTK case that worked would still work today. The parts that depend on a deleted file surviving on the media might not. A profession that used to be about recovering content is increasingly about reconstructing behavior from the traces that content leaves behind in other places. Which is, if you go back to the beginning of this episode, a more literal application of low-card than the old version ever was. So let me come back to the sentence I asked you to hold on to. A bug in a forensic tool does not look like a crash. It looks like an answer. In 2011, a murder trial in Florida drew about as much public attention as an American trial can. I am going to be extremely careful with this one. The defendant was Casey Anthony. She was acquitted of the killing on the 5th of July, 2011. That is the court outcome, and it is where the legal story ends. I am not revisiting the verdict, and I have no opinion on it to offer you. What I am interested in is one specific number that was presented as evidence. Investigators analyzed a computer's browser history using a tool called cashback, and the analysis reported 84 visits to a page concerning chloroform. 84. That number was used repeatedly by the prosecution, and it is easy to see why. 84 visits does not sound like curiosity. It sounds like planning. The true figure was 1, not 84. One visit to a page that discussed the use of chloroform in the 1800s. And the person who established that was John Bradley, the man who wrote Cashback. He found a bug in his own software. I want to walk through the mechanism because it is a beautiful example of how this kind of error happens, and it is not what people imagine. The browser was Firefox 2, which stored its history in a database format nicknamed MORC. MORC is notorious among people who have had to read it. It stores values in a way that is not consistent between records. The visit count for one entry is not reliably in the place you would expect relative to the entry itself. The tool read the count from the wrong adjacent record. It picked up a number that belonged to something else and attached it to this page. It did not crash. It did not warn. It did not return an error. It returned 84. Formatted exactly like a correct answer. And there is no way to look at the number 84 and tell that it came from the wrong row. Bradley says he identified the error and reported it to prosecutors and police immediately, about 2 weeks before deliberations. The corrected figure was not presented to the jury and the record was not corrected. I am going to stop at exactly that line. Allegations were made publicly at the time about how that was handled. I am not aware of a finding, so I am not going to characterize it. What the record shows is what I have just said. The author found the bug. He says he reported it. The corrected number did not reach the jury, and she was acquitted. The forensic lesson does not depend on any of the contested parts, which is why it is worth your time. A piece of software produced a number. The number was wrong by a factor of 84. Nobody involved could tell by looking at it. And it took the author of the tool examining his own code against a specific known awkward data format to find out. Now go back to the NIST program I mentioned, and it stops sounding like bureaucracy. Published test specifications, independent validation against them, documented before casework. That entire apparatus exists because of exactly this failure mode. Not fraud, not incompetence. A perfectly sincere tool reading a badly designed database slightly wrong and reporting the result with total confidence. This is also, I think, the honest answer to a question people ask about this profession, which is whether it is really science. The imaging and the hashing are as close to deterministic as anything in this business gets. You can prove a copy is identical to an original. That part is solid. The interpretation is where it becomes expert judgment. An expert judgment mediated by software that somebody has to have checked. Which is why the good practitioners in this field are noticeably more careful in how they phrase things than the television version would suggest. The television version says the computer proves he did it. The professional version says this artifact is consistent with this action having occurred at this time, and here is what else could produce it. So what is the job, day to day? It is worth saying plainly, because the popular image of it is wrong in a specific and boring direction. It is mostly reading. Enormous amounts of reading of things that were never written for a person to read. Operating systems keep records constantly for their own reasons, none of which involve investigation, which is precisely why the records are useful. A file that is opened leaves an entry in one place. A device that is plugged in leaves one somewhere else. A program that runs leaves one somewhere else again. None of those were designed as evidence. They were designed to make something load faster or a menu remember what you had open. That is what makes them hard to think about faking. And the work is reconciling them. This log says the drive was connected at this time. That index says the file was opened 4 minutes later. A third record says it was printed. Any one of those is weak. 3 of them agreeing is a timeline, and a timeline is what actually gets presented. This is the part that requires patience rather than brilliance, and it is most of the job. Then there's the part nobody warned you about, which is that a great deal of the work is now defeated cleanly and permanently by encryption. Full disk encryption on a device that is powered off with a password nobody has is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a wall. The imaging still works. You can copy every sector faithfully. You just end up with a perfect copy of noise. Which is why so much of modern practice focuses on the state a device is in when it is seized, and why the difference between powered on and powered off has become one of the most consequential facts at a scene. A running machine has keys in memory. A machine that has been switched off, in the ordinary case, does not, which turns a decision that used to be a formality, do we pull the plug or not, into one of the most consequential judgments at a scene, made in seconds, usually by whoever arrives first, and frequently without a specialist present to advise on it. So the profession has partly become a discipline of arriving at the right moment, which is a strange thing for a technical field to be. And I want to be honest about the shape of the career, because this series is about what these jobs are actually like. A large amount of it is corporate rather than criminal. An employee is suspected of taking client data to a competitor. A company needs to know what an intruder touched. Same methods, same rigor, lower stakes, considerably more of it, and the report is read by a lawyer either way. The part practitioners tend to mention when asked is the writing. You will spend more time producing a defensible written account of what you did than you spend doing it. Because the deliverable is not the finding. The deliverable is a document that survives someone hostile, reading it line by line. So let me give you what I think you can actually take away from this, which is 3 things, and none of them require you to own a write blocker. 1. On a traditional hard disk, deleted has never meant gone. It means the space was marked reusable and the content stayed until something needed it. On a modern SSD with trim enabled, deletion often does mean gone, genuinely erased, often within minutes, by firmware acting on its own. That is a real and recent change, and it cuts both ways depending on which side of it you are on. If you assumed your old deleted files were unrecoverable, historically you were wrong. If you assume an investigator can always get them back, on current hardware you are increasingly wrong too. And the thing that changed was not a policy or a law. It was a performance optimization for flash memory that happened to have forensic consequences nobody was consulted about. 2. The evidence that matters is usually metadata, not content. The disk that ended a decades-long investigation did it through 2 fields in a document's properties, who last saved it, and which organization the software was registered to. Not a confession, not a message. Bookkeeping generated automatically by a word processor about a church meeting agenda. Everything you produce carries that layer. It is not hidden and it is not sinister. It is just in a panel nobody opens, and it does not forget. If you take one practical habit from this episode, it is that the file you send is not the only thing you are sending. 3. And this is the one I would most like to stay with you. A forensic result is only as good as the validated tool that produced it. A number that is wrong by a factor of 84 looks exactly like a number that is right. It arrives in the same font, in the same report, with the same confidence. There is no way to detect it by inspection. The only defenses are independent tool testing, published specifications, and validation before casework, which is why NIST's program exists at all. And that generalizes well beyond forensics. Anytime a piece of software gives you a number that decides something, the question is not whether the number looks plausible. It is whether anybody has ever tested the thing that produced it against the specification, and whether you could find that test if you went looking. In this field, for a lot of tools, you can. The reports are published. That is unusual, and it is worth knowing about. I find that oddly hopeful, actually. A profession that handles evidence decided, collectively, that it did not trust its own instruments on faith and built an apparatus to check them. Most fields that depend on software have not done that. What I like about digital forensics as a job, and this series exists to look at jobs, is how unglamorous the competence is. Nobody in this story broke encryption or wrote an exploit. Somebody opened a properties panel. Somebody else noticed a database format was inconsistent and checked their own arithmetic. The skill is a refusal to accept the first plausible answer, applied for a very long time in writing. And the two cases I've used are opposite lessons deliberately. In one, careful forensics found a real thing in a place nobody thought to hide, and it held up. In the other, careful looking forensics produced a number that was wrong by 2 orders of magnitude, and it reached a courtroom anyway. Same discipline, same era. The difference between them is not talent. It is whether the tool had been checked. That is why the boring apparatus, the write blocker, the hash, the chain of custody, the published test specification, is not bureaucracy wrapped around the real work. It is the real work. The clever part is comparatively easy. Being able to prove you did not change anything is the hard part, and it is the part that decides whether any of it counts. There is one more thing I want to leave you with about the direction this is heading, because it is not obvious. As content gets harder to recover, encryption on one side, firmware erasing blocks on the other, the traces are becoming more important, not less. You may not be able to recover the document. You may still be able to establish that a device was connected at a particular minute, and that something was opened from it, and that it was later removed. That is a weaker kind of evidence, and it demands a more careful kind of expert, which is broadly good for the standard of the field. It also means the profession is getting harder in exactly the way that makes it more interesting to do. 100 years ago, Locard said every contact leaves a trace about dust and fibers in a laboratory in Lyon. It turns out to be a much better description of computers than it ever was of the physical world, because a computer cannot do anything at all without writing it down somewhere. The whole profession is the study of where somewhere is this week. Next Sunday on Secret Professions, the job on the other side of the same problem. The people who are paid to break into systems on purpose with a contract and write down how they did it. Penetration testers, how an engagement is actually scoped. What the legal paperwork has to say before anybody touches anything, and why the report is the product rather than the break-in. It pairs with today more closely than it looks because both jobs end in a document that a lawyer reads. If this was worth your time, following the channel is the thing that genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this careful version of the subject has an audience. And I would like to know something from you, because it is a real disagreement in this field. Given what trim does automatically, should investigators be allowed to demand that a seized device stays powered on, or is that a step too far? There are serious people on both sides of that, and I do not think it is settled. The comments are the place, and I read them. A closing observation that I keep coming back to. The man in Wichita was not caught by a technique that did not exist yet. He was caught by a feature of word processing software that had shipped for years and was documented in a properties panel anyone could open. The tools were ordinary. The knowledge was public. The only thing that was scarce was somebody bothering to look properly. That is true of a lot more of this field than the dramatized version admits, and it is genuinely why people stay in it. Every contact leaves a trace. In computing, that is not a principle. It is a description of how the machine works when nobody is trying. Delete something on a spinning disk and it stays. Delete it on flash and the drive may remove it before anyone asks. Either way, something somewhere wrote down that you did it. Thank you for half an hour of a Sunday. I am Niels. That was Secret Professions. Check the properties panel before you send the file.